Hello, and welcome to the Coaching Crowd podcast with me, Jay Wheatley, and my friend and co host, Zoe Hawkins.
Hi, everybody, and welcome to another podcast where this week we're talking to you about reframing. And the reason we're doing that is because it's a really important skill in coaching and probably something you use in everyday conversations. So, when you hear about what reframing is and you understand you already have the basic skills of it, it's something that you can bring more into your relationships, either as a coach or a leader. And we'd like to spend some time exploring that with you today. So, where do you want to begin, Joe?
Well, we'll start with what it is. So, in essence, it's the art of helping somebody shift the way that they view a situation or the way that they're viewing a thought or a belief that they have. So, it's helping them to be able to see it from a new angle or a new perspective. And the reason that that's so valuable is because it can open up new possibility. It can sometimes reduce the emotional charge or shift the emotions that they associate with something they're experiencing. And it can unlock or open up new choices, options for choices for people. So it's not about changing the facts or denying a reality. It's really about helping the person, your client or your coachee in the context that we're talking about, to change the frame that they put around a situation. So it can help to shift them from feeling under-resourced to resourced.
And I think there's a piece here about getting stuck.
Mm-hmm.
So, reframing can be really helpful when somebody is stuck in a perspective. And it's such a simple skill, like you say, like helping them to look at a different perspective. But you have to think that when somebody is in an experience, they can only see it through their own perspective. We only have our own values, beliefs, filters. So when we are having our experience, it can be really helpful when somebody comes in and says, yes, and let's not ignore this perspective over here. So it's a way to almost shine a spotlight on hidden alternatives and hidden choices that somebody may have denied or not being able to see. So it's a really simple skill but can actually be really powerful.
Yeah, so in essence, it's around like the meaning that you give to an event determines your experience of it. So when clients come to coaching, they'll present their situation in a particular way and they'll explain how they're feeling about that, and they'll explain that they want to get to a different situation. And sometimes it is that they want to feel differently about something. It may not even be about changing the thing itself. And so what they sometimes come to coaching for is a way to help them to reframe their experience of something. So reframing can be really helpful because we can, as you've said, we can get stuck. So we can get a bit rigid in our thinking. All of us can do it. Although, Zoe, when you were saying like people can get stuck and they can only see it in one way, I was thinking, yes, unless you've trained as a coach. And then your problem is the other extreme, which is you can see 360 degrees around your situation. And then you might need some help reframing around that. So reframing is a form or a method of disrupting that cognitive stuckness or rigidity. And it is a way to help the individual to start to re engage with some flexibility in their thinking.
Mm. I remember loads of times where we've been on long car journeys and I've been like talking about, and it was actually, I don't know if you remember it, we were on a long car journey and it was around the time when I was thinking of buying a house. So my husband's ex-military and we were bouncing around different postings. That is what they call it when somebody gets moved in the military. And I remember saying like, well, I can't buy a house because of blah, 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 and blah. And you just kept throwing these reframes in. And by the end of the car journey, I'm like, I'm going to buy a house. So, it is a way to softly and gently challenge somebody, I think, as you said, like disrupt the thinking and challenge to wait. And it's not about you putting your perspectives on another person. So it's not you saying it is this. It's just about you offering, like, well, have you thought about this? And have you thought about that? But what if what you're saying actually meant something else? And the examples that you come up with, when you're hearing somebody talk about a situation, often will come from a place of intuition. Like it's very hard to design a reframe in the moment counteract what someone is bringing in a coaching conversation, or even as a friend, but they tend to come from a place of intuition, and you're also drawing on your own perspective and how you may see things differently, and offering these alternative windows, I think, to look through.
Yeah, or how anybody else could potentially perceive it. So in a way, it's about encouraging the reframe offers the individual an opportunity to kind of take ownership of their situation again. So by starting to develop that flexibility and thinking about, oh, it's the what ifs really. Like a very simple way to describe a reframe is a what if. So let's say if you have to move house and you don't want to move house, it's like, but what if that enabled you to meet your soulmate? What if that enabled you to develop the side hustle you always wanted to do? And maybe the individual had not even thought about that, but you're connecting it to something else that you know is important to that individual. So as soon as they start to think, it's almost like a shock. It's like, oh, I just had, that wasn't on my radar at all. Oh, yeah, maybe I could. And so that ownership and that the emotional shift can start to occur. And sometimes, reframes can be really helpful to connect people with the resources that they have that they've forgotten about.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe strengths that they have or opportunities that they wanted. So it's helping them to kind of develop that neuroplasticity, really, that really wanting them to, people like to find meaning. And sometimes when they're stuck, it's because they can't understand the value in a situation. And reframing can help to reconnect them to the value or the meaning. And once they've got some meaning from it, then sometimes, they can generate and take back that ownership for themselves. But we're going to go on and talk about some specific examples in this podcast so that you can see this skill in context.
Neuroplasticity is such a cool word. And I think the way that I like normalize that is thinking about the inner coach. Reframing is really about nurturing your inner coach. It's the ability to be able to challenge yourself, and others, of course, if you're working with other people, but it's a skill that you can develop on your own, for sure. Yeah, and you mentioned there the what ifs, and I suppose we'll get into some examples. Like reframes can be questions, they can be those sort of what if questions. But I was just wondering, as you were saying that, are people listening to this podcast, well, how then is reframing different from coaching? Because coaching is asking questions, and reframes can be statements as well. So if you're working with somebody or in conversation with somebody and they just say things like, well, there's no way I could do that. You could come back with a question like you explored, Joe, around, well, what if this and what if that? Or you could simply say, but never, what, can't. It's like putting a statement into the room for extra consideration. That would be a simple example. But I think other examples, the classic ones we use to sort of bring reframing to life on our ILM program is the concept of the environment. So if you to take it out of coaching for a moment, where somebody says, "Oh, it's raining, that's a really bad thing." It's a bad thing if you want to have a garden party, but it's a good thing if you want your plants to grow. So that's what we mean by reframe. It's like that's a context reframe where you change the context in which you're able to see something. So if you think about that in the context of somebody getting turned down for a position, a classic reframe might be about thinking about what offering, like, well, what could you learn from this situation? Or, what you have shown is that you have the confidence to apply for roles. So they're focusing on the failure of not getting the position, but you're bringing in the context of learning and growth and a growth mindset. So it's shifting that person's perspective into another lens to be able to consider what else is available for me when I look at this alternative lens.
Yeah. And for those of you that like lists, we're going to chat through with you 5 different types of reframes. So if it's helpful to you to kind of think in a bit more detail about the different types. So Zoe, you were given an example there around like context, basically. So a context reframe is one that we started off in sharing really in our description of what reframing is. So that's all about shifting the situation's context. So for example, if you've got a coachee and they haven't been successful with a contract. Maybe they've tendered for something and they haven't been successful. You could say something like, yes, you lost that contract. That acknowledges their reality and what they're sharing. And you then could say, what might you now have time and space for that you didn't before? So, whereas they might be in a doom and gloom, oh, I failed, that kind of an emotional and feelings based experience and mindset, what you're doing is opening up or reframing. It's almost like taking them by the shoulders and twisting them around a little bit to look over here. So that would be an example of a context reframe.
Mm. And I think as we explore these different types of reframes, what's really important about reframe, it's not just the skill of doing it. It's really the timing and knowing when a reframe is and isn't appropriate. So in the examples you're sharing there, Joe, like if somebody's in like deep distress, you wouldn't chuck a reframe in. You'd actually hold space to honor the emotions that were coming up and support them with emotional processing. And it's in the context, you reframe in the context of the person's goal in terms of what they have shared with you about where they would like to get to in the coaching session. So, it's really important when you listen to this that you don't just start chucking reframes out whenever you hear people who are stuck. Like, we're not saying this is the only skill. This is one of those skills that you bring sensitively, appropriately, and with well judged timing.
It's a bit like chili sauce. Um, it's not something that you're going to have over everything. It's not like a gravy. It's something that gives a little accent to it. So, absolutely. It's like all coaching skills, really. It's about understanding what they are, how to use them, and also when to use them so that they can have the most beneficial impact for the client. And of course, the client might not you might offer a reframe and it might not land for the client. And that's okay because you don't, as we always say, you don't offer it in an attached way. It's just an offering. And there may be something there for the client, or they might ignore it. They might not even, it might not land at all. And that's okay too. So yeah, then we've got the content reframe, and that's really about supporting them to shift the meaning around it. So an example of that can be if a client has has a position where they feel that they're too controlling. So we're not talking about a situation when other people have said that, but maybe the client is exploring, I think maybe I'm a bit too controlling as a manager or as a leader. But maybe there's been no evidence of that, or they're not sure. And what they're really seeking in the coaching conversation is reassurance and exploration. But a reframe around that, the client saying that they're too controlling, could be, what if that's your deep care for excellence that is speaking up to you? And so it's one way of enabling the client to really explore the full context and the meaning that they are making from the experiences that they are having. And the client might say, oh, I'd never thought about it that way. Yeah, I think in some ways it is, but I still would like to become less controlling. I would like to do, and explain what they want. So it may help them to get a bit more specific about what they want to achieve in terms of their goal. It might also help to lighten the load, like the guilt or the shame that they might feel about this judgment that they have of themselves being too controlling, and being able to see that there are some, it's coming from a good place, if you like, in them. So it doesn't need to be a complete shift. Sometimes it's a loosening or a
Mm.
development.
I think the content reframes are really powerful because they can shatter long held beliefs in a very quick conversation. So another one might be around being disorganized or being lazy, and sort of carrying this label. And it may come up in a coaching session when you're talking around, I don't know, prioritization, planning, efficiency, whatever it might be. And a coachee might just share, oh, I've always just been lazy, or I've always just been disorganized. And a reframe can be offered around, well, and particularly if I was coming in here to say, particularly if you know your client. So, in the example you shared, if you know your client has a value around care and quality, then you're going to know that that's showing up. And in this example, so around kind of being disorganized and lazy, if you know that for your client, that's more of a story than a fact, you're able to bring something. What if you know how to rest? What if you know how to be spontaneous? Or maybe that's your value of excitement and spontaneity and fun coming in. So it helps that person to just like look at their whole self rather than this one sort of confined thing. And I think content reframes, when done really well with what you know about a client, can really help to dissolve um, stuck perspectives, I think would be the way to describe it.
Yeah, and also sometimes when clients say things like that, you can share your own experience of them in the session, which might be a counter to the fear, for example, that they're sharing with you. So those can be particularly powerful because it's your truth of them. And so all of a sudden they're like, it breaks that decision that they've made that they are always a particular way. And so it starts to open up a window of, oh, yes, maybe I can sometimes be that, and I can sometimes be other things. And then it becomes more around the balance.
Mm.
So I think so we've got the context reframe, the content reframe. Another example is what we call a positive intent reframe. And that is really about helping the coachee to see the positive intention behind their behavior. So you may have a client who talks about perfectionism. I think I've shared before, like I'm a reframed I'm a reformed perfectionist, although I do have to keep an eye out for that, like on an ongoing basis. So having knowledge about it is very helpful. But if a client has been sharing with you, like I just need this to be right. It's another expression of perfectionism, really. I need it to be like this. It's really important. I just want it to be perfect. If it's not X, Y, and Z, you could offer your perfectionism may be your way of ensuring safety and quality. So, what you're doing as the coach is you're highlighting what are the benefits of the client's attention to detail, for example. So, it's not saying, oh, yeah, don't do anything about your perfectionism. It's just helping to create that balance. So, coaching is a lot about supporting people to be able to shift out of quite extreme views. People tend to be like always, never, these absolutes. And so reframes can just help to reset that and maybe bring it back into, as I was saying before, like sometimes yes, sometimes not.
Mm.
And it's about choice.
And it's the balance of reframes, as we said before, because actually, with that one, you could ask a question like, well, what's the positive intent of your perfectionism? Which is an equally valid way of helping the client to explore it. And, how do you choose about what you do in the moment? Sometimes it's about the pace of the conversation and what you've been doing kind of before and where the conversation is going. So reframes for me are like quick shocks to the system. They are a way to get a different perspective sort of into your client's mind to help them unlock something, rather than questions can be more of a gentle pace, more of a, I don't know, a flow. Like it's an energy for me, So questions are about flowing and exploring, and reframes are like, right, let's get to the point. Let's bottom line this. So it can depend on where you are in your coaching conversation, what the client needs perhaps at the time.
I metaphorically, I was thinking, that spicy sauce chili thing example I gave earlier. And I was just thinking, what's another way to describe a reframe? I was thinking about, it's like your coach, as a coach, you're like offering them a spoonful of a food or a recipe that they've never tasted before. And they'll taste it, they're either going to go like, it's really nice, like, oh yeah, I like this other perspective that you've offered me here, or they're going to go straight to the sink and want to spit it out because it's like, no, it doesn't fit with their identity of themselves. And that might be an indicator then that there's some work to do around identity that would then enable them to be able to accept that if they want to have that. So, if we take the lens out a little bit wider in terms of reframe, and we're going to share with you what a systemic reframe is. So, think about this as like helping the client to zoom out, and it's about helping them to see the larger system, the larger relationships and impact that exist around the thing that they've brought to coaching. So if you're working with a leader, for example, or a manager, and they are talking about some conflict or tension in the team that might be between them and a member of the team, or maybe it's occurring between a couple of members of the team, and they're wanting to explore how to deal with that, how to enable that to resolve or be better, different in some way. You could offer a reframe. And an example of that might be, what if the team conflict is the system trying to balance itself and signal a growth edge? Now that language might just be to the coach. They're like, they don't even know what that means, which is great, because then they're like, what does that mean? So if they ask you what it means, sometimes that's because they can sense there's something in that for them to be able to look at this situation differently. And what it can do is depersonalize it. And sometimes it also takes away the urgency that a client can feel about solving and fixing a situation. And instead, let them enter more into a, perhaps this is a let it be kind of a situation.
Yeah, and when we look at systemic reframes from a statement perspective, so that one is a question.
Mm-hmm.
I think you have to judge your relationship with your client, and I think you have opportunities when you're reframing to be provocative. So, for example, in that where leader is exploring conflict, you might simply leave a statement in the coaching, such as, "Well, those two people aren't alone in the conflict, are they?" And the lead, you probably sort of see, your coachee be a bit like, what do you mean? Because they're used to answering questions and they're used to a direct, and they have to sort of make sense of that themselves. And they'll probably come back to you and say, what do you mean by that? And you might simply say, well, the team are part of a system. I'm wondering what role the system has to play here. So statements and questions can go hand in hand to help to reframe, a situation and a perspective that the client is bringing.
Yeah, so we've talked about context reframe, content reframe, positive intent reframe, and a systemic reframe. And there are some overlaps, across these, as there are in all things when we describe them. So the final one that we're going to share is related to time. So you can call it a time reframe or a temporal reframe. And this is about offering the opportunity to the client to step out of the here and now and almost like that bring their future self into it, because that is going to help them to gain a new perspective. So you could ask them things like, in 5 years time, how might you view this differently? So you're offering the possibility that of being able to see this current thing differently and enabling them the opportunity or giving them the invite to step out. You could simply say, how would your future self or how would your retired self view this situation? You could go back the other way and say, how would your child self view this situation? So it can be quite playful. But as Zoe said earlier, it's a judgment around your relationship, what you know of the client, what their goal is, how they're feeling about things, what they want to achieve. So you've got to weigh all of that up when you're making a decision as to whether to offer a reframe, which is that little shock element.
Mm. And you don't need to know all the different 5 types of reframes. Ultimately, it's about, knowing that there are lots of different ways to reframe, like jokes can be reframes, banter can be reframes. In everyday conversation, just start to notice, when are you reframing the things that your children say, that your partner says, that your colleagues and peers say, because you will be doing it because it's a natural conversational habit. So the more you pay attention to when you're doing it, the more you'll recognize, I have that skill. And it's really about being able to take that skill and use it consciously and purposefully to support your coachee with the outcome that they want to have in a session. Or if you're a leader, to support your team or your direct reports with the outcomes that they want to have for the work that they're doing. So really important skill, and I hope we've given you a good tour of different ideas today.
Yeah, and in a practical sense, how managers and leaders can use reframing. So it could be where you've got resistance to change, and you might ask things like, what opportunities might this change create for your growth? So where people are focusing on like, oh, I don't like this. Here's an opportunity to reframe it. We talked about where in a conflict situation where you've got perhaps some low morale in your team, you could ask things like, in these challenges, what strengths have we seen emerge? Where there's been failure or setbacks, we touched upon this earlier, you can ask questions about what is the learning? And how can we apply that moving forwards? So there are lots of everyday situations that you can use it. And as a coach, how you master the skill of reframing is firstly around deep presence. So it's about not listening for, you're listening to the content and what the client's saying, but what you're really listening for is what's the frame that they're putting around it. And what we mean by that is, what are the assumptions? What are the beliefs that are behind that? And how is that connected to the meaning that they're making? And that will help you to connect with what might be a useful reframe. So it links to what you're hearing. You're demonstrating to your client that you are listening and hearing what they're saying, and you're not fixing anything. You're really focused on opening up a new possibility for them to consider. So we hope that the discussion today has catalyzed some ideas for you. Maybe you've got an important or a critical conversation coming up. Perhaps you've been working with a client for a while and they've got a bit stuck. And maybe there's something in our podcast today that can help you as you move forwards.
Yeah, so if you're interested in gaining more skills and coming and training as a coach, then please take a look at our quiz, which is which coaching course is right for me. And you can find that over at mycoachingcourse.com.